Breaking news from Eastern Europe. A classified diplomatic cable has surfaced. The Zelensky just learned what every Ukrainian leader fears most. The West is negotiating without him. Here's what we know. Over the past 6 weeks, back channels between Washington, Moscow, and Brussels have intensified. The terms are becoming clear, and Ukraine isn't at the table. Not officially, not really. This is the moment when geopolitical reality crashes into wartime optimism, when promises made in 2022 evaporate in 2025, when a nation fighting for survival discovers it may be fighting alone. What does this mean for Ukraine, for NATO, and for the global order? That's what we're examining today. To understand why Zelensky feels betrayed, we need to understand why Western support was always fragile. Let's start with the fundamentals. Ukraine is not a NATO member. It has no Article 5 protection. It has no legal guarantee of Western military support. What it always had was a political choice by the West to support it. And political choices can change. When in February 2022, the Western response was surprising. Unity, resolve, unprecedented military aid over 3 years. The United States alone sent $113 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. Europe matched it with another $113 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. Europe matched it with another $113 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. NATO expanded. Sweden and Finland joined. The alliance seemed energized, purposeful. But here's the structural problem nobody wanted to discuss. Ukraine cannot win a prolonged attritional war against Russia. Russia has 44 million people. Ukraine has 38 million and shrinking due to immigration and casualties. Russia's defense industrial capacity is ramping up. By 2024, Russian munitions production exceeded Western production by a factor of 3. By 2025, that gap has only widened. Russia can sustain losses. Ukraine cannot. This isn't pessimism. It's mathematics. The second structural problem, Western publics are tired. In the United States, support for military aid to Ukraine has declined from 70% in 2022 to 48%. In Germany, polls show 60% fatigue with the conflict. In Italy, Spain, and Hungary, traditionally weaker on Ukraine, public opinion has turned against indefinite commitment. The initial shock of Russian aggression has faded. Economic concerns at home have returned. The news cycle has moved on. The third structural problem, energy insecurity and economic divergence. Europe's energy crisis of 2022-2023 hit hard. Deindustrialization, rising unemployment, political fragmentation. Hungary under Orban has become openly skeptical of Ukraine aid. Poland, despite proximity to the conflict, faces domestic political pressure. Germany's economy contracted. France began hedging. The unified front was always thinner than it appeared. And then there's the American factor. The 2020 election brought a new administration to power with a fundamentally different worldview. The previous administration saw NATO expansion in Ukraine support as bull, works against Russian hegemony. The current administration views the conflict as a regional problem, not an American priority. America first doesn't mean funding an endless war in Eastern Europe. This is the structural context. It matters because it explains why back channels opened, not because Western leaders are suddenly evil or duplicit, but because the original coalition was built on temporary alignment, not permanent interest. Now let's walk through the events of the past 8 months. This is where optimism turns to shock. In April 2025, a senior American diplomat met privately with Russian counterparts in Geneva. The meeting was technically about humanitarian corridors and ceasefire modalities, but the real discussion, according to leaked cables, centered on territorial concessions. The American position was blunt. Ukraine cannot recover all territory. It's militarily impossible. Continuing to fight for every city will destroy the country. Better to negotiate now while Ukraine retains leverage. Better to freeze the conflict at current lines than watch it deteriorate further. The Russian response was equally clear. Current lines are unacceptable. Russia wants Donbas in corridor access to Crimea, non-negotiable. But here's the critical moment. The Americans didn't reject this out of hand. They said they would consult allies and explore modalities. Translation: we'll see if Ukraine can be convinced. By June, the European Union began its own parallel negotiation. The EU's position was pragmatic and depressing. France and Germany, exhausted by the economic burden, floated the idea of a negotiated settlement with territorial compromises. Poland objected loudly. The UK post-Brexit had limited leverage. The result, no European consensus. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Russian officials, not for Putin. That remains politically impossible, but for lower level figures involved in deportations and war crimes. This signaled that the West was preparing populations for eventual negotiations. You can't negotiate with people you've indicted for atrocities unless you decide those indictments are complications rather than non starters. Here's where it gets acute. Senior Ukrainian officials were quietly informed, not directly, but through cutouts, that Western negotiating positions had hardened. The Americans made clear they would not fund a conflict indefinitely. The Germans indicated they wanted a settlement by year end. Even the British, traditionally hawkish on Russia, acknowledged that a frozen conflict might be preferable to escalation. Zelensky's response was fury mixed with desperation. He called emergency meetings with Biden administration officials. He pleaded, "Give us the weapons we need. Let us attack Russian territory. Give us a guarantee of NATO membership post-settlement. Anything to show that the sacrifice was for a purpose." The American response: "According to reports, Mr. President, you fought with tremendous courage, but America cannot fight this war for Ukraine. Ukrainians must be realistic about what's achievable. We're prepared to help you negotiate the best possible terms." Translation: were done 3 weeks ago. A classified State Department memo leaked to the press. The memo outlined the American negotiating framework. Ukraine cedes Crimea and all of Donbas. Permanent loss, a demilitarized zone along the border monitored by international observers, not NATO. Security guarantees for the remainder of Ukraine through non-NATO channel. Bilateral treaties with Western powers, but nothing automatic or binding. War. Reparations discussions postponed indefinitely. Russia's removal from international sanctions delayed, contingent on behavioral improvements. This is the framework, and Ukraine was not consulted in its drafting. Zelensky's reaction was immediate and anguished. In a televised address, he said, "We are being asked to accept permanent loss of our sovereign territory. We are being abandoned by the very nations that promised support." He's right. That's exactly what's happening. Now, let's think through what this means, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire international order. Ukraine faces a choice between two catastrophes: accept a negotiated settlement and lose 20% of its territory that contains coal reserves, agricultural, land, and industrial capacity, or reject the settlement and continue a war it cannot win while Western military aid dries up. In either scenario, Ukraine suffers, but the second scenario is arguably worse. Fighting for another 3 years without Western support, facing a Russian military that's only growing stronger, consuming your manpower and industrial capacity for no strategic gain. The rational choice geopolitically is to negotiate, but the human cost is immeasurable. Expect Ukrainian society to fracture. The military leadership will resist the negotiation. Nationalist political movements will demand fight to the end strategies. The government will face internal legitimacy crisis. Some regions might seek separate negotiations with Russia. You could see Ukraine effectively partitioned and not by Russian conquest, but by internal collapse. This is the deeper crisis. NATO's entire deterrent structure depends on credibility, on the belief that the alliance actually backs its member. What message does abandoning Ukraine send to Poland, the Baltics, Romania? Those countries are now asking, if NATO couldn't secure Ukraine militarily, how does it secure us? If the Americans decide European conflicts are costly, will we be next? The answer increasingly looks like we cannot count on America. Expect NATO members to rearm independently. Poland is already buying advanced weaponry. The Baltics are upgrading defenses frantically and expect a rash of bilateral security agreements between small European states and major powers outside NATO. Some may even explore accommodation with Russia. Russia has learned a crucial lesson. The West not sustain a geopolitical conflict for more than 3 years. If the costs are significant, domestic publics tire, elites fracture, economic pressure mounts. If Russia can simply outlast Western commitment, it win. This creates a dangerous template. Want to conquer your neighbors, just start a grinding attritional war, endure Western criticism and sanctions. Wait for Western unity to shatter. Negotiate when you've seized enough territory to declare victory. The pattern worked in Ukraine. It will be attempted elsewhere. Fundamentally, This is about the decline of American order. The United States built its post-1945 dominance on two pillars: military might and credibility. The military part remains intact. The U.S. military is still the most capable force on Earth, but credibility is fracturing. If America won't defend Ukraine, a European state fighting an invader, why would it defend Taiwan? Why would it defend Japan? The global implications cascade. Expect alignment shifts. Smaller powers will head. Some will move toward China, Russia, or regional powers. The unipolar moment is ending. Timeline for next 6 months. November 2025. Expect the formal negotiating framework to be announced. The language will be euphemistic: phase settlement, interim agreements, confidence building measures. The reality will be territorial partition. December 2025. Zelensky will make a momentous decision: either accept the framework and pursue negotiations or reject it and fight alone. If he rejects it, Western military aid likely ceases by year-end, January-February 2026. If negotiations proceed, expect them to be brutal and protracted. Russia will demand maximalist concessions. Ukraine will resist, but both sides know a settlement is coming. The fighting will gradually diminish, replaced by diplomatic positioning. By spring 2026, a ceasefire of some form will likely be in place, not a peace treaty. Those take years, but a frozen conflict similar to Korea and Ukraine will be forever diminished. Here's what's truly happening beneath the diplomatic language and leaked cables. The West promised Ukraine something it could never deliver: victory, not because the West lacked weapons or money, but because sustaining that commitment required something the modern West cannot summon: patience, sacrifice, unity, and long-term strategic purpose. Ukraine is learning painfully that geopolitics is ultimately about power, not justice, not morality, not promises. Power. A nation without great power, allies without nuclear weapons, without strategic indispensability, is ultimately vulnerable to the preferences of those who do have power. Ukraine has fought with stunning courage, but courage cannot overcome mathematics. The broader lesson: we are witnessing the erosion of the rule-based international order. The West built that order after 1945. It was predicated on the idea that law, institutions, and collective security could prevent wars. But that order required constant investment and occasional sacrifice. The current generation of Western leaders has decided that sacrifice is too costly, that long-term commitments are too burdensome, that paying the price of order is less attractive than hoping someone else pays it. This will have consequences far beyond Ukraine, in Taiwan, in the Middle East, in Africa, wherever small or medium powers face pressure from larger rivals. They're watching and learning that the West's guarantees are negotiable. The warning is simple: a geopolitical order that abandons its principles in a moment of difficulty is an order in terminal decline. Ukraine is not a sideshow. It's a signal about the future of international politics, and that future looks increasingly anarchic. This is the reality beneath the diplomatic cables. This is what Zelensky now understands, and this is what the world should be grappling with right now. What happens next depends on choices made in the next 60 days. Stay informed.